transportation alternatives, and of course, Save the Sound. So thank you to everyone who's worked in partnership to make this event happen. And so we just want to let folks know that this is a general workshop so that folks in our community can learn more about environmental assessments, environmental impact statements, the sort of environmental review processes that are either state-led or federally mandated, what these documents are, how to read them, and how you can meaningfully engage in the process that comes after these documents become public. So I just want to share some community agreements. Please, if you have questions, feel free to share those in the chat, but we will ask folks to stay on mute until the end of the presentation, at which point there will be some time for question and answer and discussion as well. So just acknowledging that this is a hybrid event. There are folks in the space physically with us as well as online. And so welcome everyone. And I will, with that, kick it off to Save the Sound to start the workshop.
Thank you, Victoria. Let me just raise my laptop here a little bit. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for being here this evening. It's nice to see so many people joining us, especially when we're talking about something like environmental assessments and impact statements that seem a little daunting at first, but we hope through this workshop we can break it down and make it more digestible for everyone. And just really quick, as Victoria mentioned, we do have people joining us in person. So if you hear the doorbell in the background, people are joining us. To introduce myself, my name is David Abreu. I'm the clean water advocate at Save the Sound. And I'll pass it over to my colleague who's with me today.
And I'm Dara Ilowski. I'm the New York staff attorney at Save the Sound.
And again, as Victoria shouted out at the start, huge thanks to Transportation Alternatives and the Bronx River Alliance for co-hosting this event with us. There are quite a few projects that overlap amongst all of our groups. So it's a great time to host this workshop. So let's get right into it. My buttons want to work. Click. There we go. Let's take a quick look at our discussion overview and what we'll be talking about today. We're just going to go through some really quick group introductions, and then we'll get right into the bulk of the presentation, which is what is the environmental review process. As Victoria also mentioned at the beginning, we'll be going through the city, state, and federal processes, what those entail, and some of the differences between them. We'll be looking at two project studies tonight. The first will concern itself with the Bally's Casino and Hotel project at Ferry Point Park, and the environmental process that falls under. And then we'll also talk about the Cross Bronx Expressway Five Bridges project, which is a NEPA regulated project, and we'll talk about what that means as well. Then we'll get into some next steps, some action steps that we can all take as public to influence these decisions, and then we'll jump into some Q&A. Just to outline some goals that we have for this workshop and for all of us when we leave today. Certainly a better understanding of these state and federal environmental review processes. Again, this is the main focus of this presentation, right? We want to make sure that you all leave here today with a better understanding of how to get involved, what these documents are, and the key elements that are within them, and how you can spot them out. And that leads to better confidence in participating in these public discussions and public comment periods. I'll mention it later in the presentation, but one thread that we want to keep throughout this entire workshop is that we want to enable all of you to be able to advocate for whatever issue it is that you have, and to feel comfortable doing that. Everyone's unique experience is unique, and those are exactly the perspectives that we need people to hear. These agencies and people empowered to hear from. And then lastly, we'll highlight upcoming opportunities for you to do just that. So just briefly to introduce Save the Sound, and we'll run through some of the other groups as well. We're a regional nonprofit that works between New York and Connecticut to preserve and protect the Long Island Sound. And the Bronx in particular is very unique to that because we share quite significant coastline with the Long Island Sound. And in particular, New York City's portion of the Sound, what we call the Western Narrows, throughout the years has suffered quite significantly, through impaired water quality, and other factors that have really made it hard, if not impossible, for people to really enjoy the waters of New York City and the Bronx. So we do that through a couple different ways. I'm part of the water quality team. Dara's part of our legal staff. And we have ecological restoration team and legislative advocates on staff as well that all work together to accomplish this goal. We have transportation alternatives with us, and I believe Anna just stepped out of the room. But just to quickly shout them out, Transportation Alternatives is a wonderful group working throughout the Bronx and uptown New York City to really advocate for alternative modes of transportation, as their name suggests. We tend to think of New York City, as just the trains and buses, but there are a whole expanding network of pedestrian and bicycle lanes that we're really advocating for as well, and just alternate modes of getting around the city. I'll quickly toss it over to Victoria if she would like to just quickly say a couple words about Bronx River Alliance.
Sure. Thanks, David. Just want to name that the Bronx River Alliance, we're a public-private partnership with New York City Parks. We work to serve as a coordinated voice for the river, to protect, improve, and restore the Bronx River corridor so that it can be a healthy ecological, recreational, educational, and economic resource for every community through which the river flows. And so a lot of that work is not only restoring the Bronx River corridor, but also advocating with the leadership of local community members to make sure that this river continues to be on a path of restoration.
Thank you for that, Victoria. And Anna just joined us again, and I did my best to introduce Transportation Alternatives. What do you like to say? Just anything really, really quick before we move on?
Yeah.
Good.
We are a walking, biking, and public transit advocacy organization. And in particular, the Bronx Activist Committee, the QR code that you see on screen right now, focuses on that stuff in the Bronx and Harlem and above. So come join us if those things are of interest to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. All right. So that's who's in the room with us right now. And now let's get into what I was calling the bulk of our workshop today, the environmental review process as a whole. Just a quick overview. What is the environmental review process, right? We say that and it seems like this daunting kind of process. And at first it is, but there are quite a few points throughout this process where we can influence decisions being made. And so whether at the city, state, or federal level, all agencies that are planning certain projects or actions, as they call them, must go through an environmental review process to examine the impacts that action, that project will have on the environment. So that can include things like water quality, right, through stormwater or wastewater drainage. It can include things like air quality, of course, and overall considerations for disadvantaged communities. They're also required to examine social and economic conditions as well. But today we'll focus on the environmental side of things, and again, how we can get involved. And of course, there are various nuances to the processes depending on which agency, which level of government, even, the project itself. But we'll go through all of those. Dara's going to walk us through quite a bit of that. But generally, we must consider adverse environmental impacts, alternatives, mitigation to those impacts, and a whole host of other, factors. So I believe Dara will be taking it over from here. And Dara, please.
Great, thanks, David, and thank you again, everyone, for being here this evening. So this is a participatory presentation. I'm going to talk for a little bit, but there's going to be a lot of opportunity to hear from you all and the folks in here as well. So be ready for that. It's not a quiz. It's just, soliciting some of your thoughts on your concerns about the environment in your community. But to start off, I'm just going to give a quick overview of the federal, state, and city processes. So I'm ultimately going to be focusing mostly on the state processes and shouting out the city processes and occasionally the federal processes where substantial and notable differences exist. But part of why we're not focusing on so much on federal today, although David will walk us through, a sample federal project later in the presentation, but we're not going too in depth on the details of that because the federal process is unfortunately seriously in flux under our new federal administration. Regulations that we've had for 50-ish years are going away. So it's a little too in the weeds to get into in the context of this project. But the good news is that New York State still has our processes in place, as does New York City. So we still have a lot of power there, and we do still have a lot of power under the federal government. It's just gotten a lot more complicated beyond the scope of this workshop. But just to briefly go over that, so the federal process is called the National Environmental Policy Act, or rather that's the name of the legislation that creates the federal process for environmental review. Any project that has federal agency involvement or funding where the federal agency is exercising significant control, that will fall under NEPA. That said, there's a lot of projects that are involving joint federal and state agencies. And where that's the case, the state still has to fulfill the state requirements. And they can do that by relying on the federal document, but they still have to make sure that the federal document fulfills state requirements as well. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So for a federal project, if there will be reasonably foreseeable significant impacts, the agency is to complete an environmental impact statement. If, on the other hand, the significance is unknown or not reasonably foreseeable, they instead have to do an environmental assessment, which is a slightly lower bar in terms of the depth of the analysis. The agencies also have discretion to decide to skip the EA and just go right to the environmental impact statement under NEPA. If they do conclude that indeed the project will not have significant environmental impacts, they publish what's called a finding of no significant impact, also known as a FONSI. All of these processes involve certain have certain actions that do not have to go through these processes. In the federal context, those are called categorical exclusions. And these are projects that the agency has determined are just generally don't have a significant impact. So sorry.
In-room technical difficulty. There we go. All right, we're back.
So there's no need to go through the whole environmental review process. Those tend to be things like routine maintenance, fixing federal buildings, paving roads, stuff like that. And then the New York State process is the State Environmental Quality Review Act, also known as SEQR. It's very, very similar to NEPA. Some people call it mini NEPA for that reason. And it applies to any state or local agency actions. And there's a slightly different vocabulary here for under SEQR. Initially, the agency will do a environmental assessment form. There's a standard form they go through. And if that reveals that there's at least one significant adverse environmental impact, then the agency will go through the environmental impact statement process, which again is very similar to the NEPA process. And the language in SEQR for projects that don't need to go through the process is called type 2. And there is a list of type 2 actions that apply all across New York State. And then individual agencies also have their own lists that they can supplement the statewide list with. And then since we are in New York City, quick shout out to SEQR, the City Environmental Quality Review. It's basically SEQR. You still have to comply with SEQR. There's just some additional guidance that the city requires for projects that involve city agency action. There's a very silly difference here where it's an EAS, an environmental assessment statement, instead of environmental assessment form. And there also, we're going to quickly shout out with a little more detail later, the Uniform Land Use Review procedure, which is a process that involves even more opportunities for public involvement for certain land use decisions within the city. And then, like I said, I'm going to focus today mostly on New York State and some on the city, with David doing a bit on federal later. So what's the point? Maybe you already know some of this. Maybe that's why you're here this evening, but why should you stick with us through this lovely evening? This is the environmental review processes at every level present a great opportunity to have your voice heard and to have your concerns about your community impact government decisions. And then I'll get into some of this lingo momentarily, but there's a scoping process, which happens at the very beginning of the environmental review process. And that is a great opportunity for you to help shape where the EIS is going to go, to set the scope that the EIS is going to pursue. And that's how you can ensure that the major issues that you're most concerned about are going to be addressed in the environmental impact statement. And then once you have submitted comments, the lead agency has to consider those comments. And in the case of an environmental impact statement, they also have to respond to what they consider substantive comments. And we'll talk a little bit later about what a substantive comment is. And then as an attorney, I have to also mention that participating in the process is really important if you want to potentially go to court over the issue. Comment periods are really important. Everything that you submit becomes part of what's called the administrative record, which is what a court will later rely on to make their decision about whether or not the agency acted legally when they completed their environmental review process. So one example is a case up in Buffalo recently. It's the full site for those of you who want to look it up there, East Side Parkways Coalition versus New York State DOT, where community organizations challenged a environmental review of a project related to a highway project that would, it's a long story, but basically would entrench a highway that cut across a historically disadvantaged community and failed to consider getting rid of the highway. And the court agreed with the community members and sent the analysis back to the agency to do it again and do it right this time. Okay, so here we have the SEQR timeline. And the items highlighted in green are your opportunities to get involved. So the first thing that happens under SEQR is the agency responsible for the action publishes the notice of what they've concluded from the environmental assessment form. So they can conclude there's a significant impact and therefore there needs to be an EIS. They can conclude that there's no significant impact and therefore they don't have to do the EIS, or they can do something called a condition negative declaration, which is that the project will not have significant impacts because they'll be prevented by mitigation measures. And that last one, the condition negative declaration, that's your earliest possible opportunity for public involvement. If the agency goes in that direction, the public has 30 days to review and participate in a written comment period. Alternatively, the agency could conclude there will be significant impacts. That's where we end up in our environmental impact statement process. So the first opportunity for public involvement there is scoping. The agency has to make the draft scope available and allow written comments or oral comments. Sometimes they will hold a public hearing. There's no specific timeline for the state generally, but DEC recommends 20 days to review and comment on that draft scope. In the city, we have a little bit more time. The SEQR does require that the scope is made public 30 to 45 days before a required public hearing, and that the public comment period remain open for at least 10 days after the meeting. Once scoping is done, and that, like I said, scoping informs what is going to go into an environmental impact statement. So scoping is your opportunity to write in or come to a hearing and say, I'm really worried about stormwater runoff from this project. I want to make sure that in your EIS, you're going to consider stormwater runoff. I'm really worried about how this is going to impact climate change and the greenhouse gas emissions from this project. Make sure you consider that in your environmental impact statement. And so it's really, really important. The agency doesn't have to consider anything in the EIS that doesn't show up in the scope. So very important. But once we have our scope and we're getting into the EIS process, the first thing that happens is a draft EIS is published online in what's called the Environmental Notice Bulletin. And there's a link to that up top under step 1 of SEQR. And that involves at least a 30-day public review and written comment period. And again, under the city process, a public hearing and opportunity for oral comment is required. It's not required under the state process, but sometimes they opt to do it anyway. After that is completed, the agency will publish their final EIS, also in the Environmental Notice Bulletin, which will be followed by a finding statement, which says, here's what we concluded based on that FEIS that you already saw published. There is a 10-day comment period between the FEIS and the finding statement, where you can certainly feel free to submit comments, but the agency is not required to change anything based on those comments. And then at the end of all of that, that's the end of the SEQR process, or the SEQR process, the city process. But if you're left unsatisfied, if you think that something has still gone wrong with the FEIS, or that the FEIS couldn't have provided legal support for the findings that the agency made, that's when you can consult a lawyer and consider pursuing what's called Article 78 judicial review. Strongly suggest consulting an attorney before you go down that road. And they're just to talk through possible arguments, whether it's worth your time to pursue, but certainly an option that is there if you're dissatisfied with the outcome of the SEQR process. And for that, you have 4 months from the agency's final action to file your suit. And as promised, we'll take a brief visit to NEPA, which is the federal environmental review process, which also does involve opportunities for public engagement. But these days, the specifics of what that looks like are dictated by the individual agency's regulations, which there are far too many of to go through every single one. We'd be here for days. So I just wanted to highlight, because one of the projects that we're talking about later, the Cross Bronx expansion, is the federal lead agency there is the Federal Highway Administration. So just wanted to, as an example, note their regulations. And you can see how they are a little bit different from SEQR. The most notable maybe being, to me at least, that they have no obligation to circulate an environmental assessment for public comment. It does have to be available, but it just has to be available in person, though the agency does encourage online availability. And there is a 30-day public comment process for the EA as well, though the agency can certainly extend that if they want to. That's just the minimum that's required. And if the agency does determine that because there is a significant impact, or there's likely, to be a significant impact, they have to prepare an environmental impact statement. You will have 45 to 60 days to comment on that draft environmental impact statement. And again, it's encouraged but not required that the DEIS is available online. But it has to be available at least in person. All right, so in terms of getting into the specifics of what goes into a environmental impact statement in the context of SEQR or SEQR, we're going to do this as a case study of the Bally's Hotel and Casino Complex at Ferry Point Park. And I'm going to turn it over to David to talk a little bit about this project.
Cool. Thank you, Dara. And I'm going to give Dara a quick break after her walkthrough at the start there. As Dara mentioned, this is our project that falls under SEQR SEQR and SEQR, the state and city processes. In general, Bally seeks quite a few land use changes and requires various permits from different state agencies. So that's how you can see the city and state nexus kind of overlapping. Parkland alienation legislation is also required as part of the process. So again, the state involvement coming into play there. DEIS, draft environmental impact statement, has already been issued, and you are actually able to view it online now. And we'll link you to that later on towards the end of the workshop. But it's there, and you can review it at your discretion and come up with your own comments from there. And we'll also talk about the opportunities for future comment. Just some quick updates as to where we are now, and then Daryl will get into the specifics of how SEQR and SEQR flow into this draft environmental impact statement. But just to cover where we're at now, the local community board 10, recently voted against the project with a vote of 29-5, which is an overwhelming majority response against the project. And state legislation was actually introduced. I believe it was introduced last week in both chambers of the legislature in Albany. So your state senator, or rather the state senator and state assemblyman in the area, have introduced that legislation. And now that we kind of set the scene for this project, I'll kick it back to Dara to go through some more of the specifics on the environmental impact statement.
All right, so this one will probably come as no surprise that the first requirement in an environmental impact statement that we'll go through is the EIS has to identify significant adverse environmental impacts. And one thing that's exciting about SEQR or SEQR is that it actually requires that the agency consider these significant adverse environmental impacts and then choose a course of action that minimizes or avoids these impacts. That's one important distinction from NEPA that's worth noting. NEPA, on the other hand, is a purely procedural statute. It just tells the agency what procedures they have to take before they ultimately probably go with the same project they were planning to do in the first place. And they just have to have a rational explanation for why they've ended up with that decision. With SEQR, on the other hand, the agent, if there's an alternative that will minimize or avoid environmental impacts better than what maybe the agency was originally planning to do, the agency has to very seriously consider heading in that other less impactful direction. So just a few examples of potential impacts that might come up under SEQR: air and water quality. I'm not gonna read through all of these, but they're on your screen. But some of them to shout out: air and water quality, climate change, flooding, impacts to public health, impacts to wildlife, traffic, impacts to recreational resources and open space, and of course disproportionate impacts to disadvantaged communities, which we will talk more about in a couple slides. So here's the first of this, the public participation that I promised. So this is a one of a couple maps, and I'll maybe scoot forward in the presentation a few slides to show you another map in a second. But this is a map of what Bally's is proposing for this hotel and casino complex, like we said, square in Ferry Point Park, which for those of you who don't know is a public park here in the Bronx. You can see it's right on the East River and Westchester Creek. So it's a beautiful waterfront location. So would love to hear from some of you all. You can either raise your hand to speak or write your thoughts in the chat about what kinds of impacts you think a hotel and casino complex in here might have. And some thoughts, some prompts here, consider the size. This project would involve the alienation of about 18 acres of public parkland. And just real quick, what that means is those 18 acres would no longer be considered New York City public parkland. They would be turned over from public usage to this private corporation. So that is this red line is where the casino and hotel complex would be. And you can see kind of on the right side of this map, these are neighborhoods above our neighborhoods as well. It's again on the waterfront. It's on top of a former landfill. And so let's maybe get some hands for some thoughts that people are having about what you might be worried about with a project like this.
So right now, I think in the chat, we see trash and litter and harms to wildlife. Actually, that's a great shout out on the trash and litter, right? I mean, we already kind of pollute through that way in different areas. And, if they're expanding this area to expanding the road and expanding an area where people can unfortunately leave garbage, that's certainly something to take into account. And we see Ed's hand in the chat. Ed, feel free to go ahead and unmute.
I think I'm unmuted. Yeah, good evening, everyone. So the first that comes to mind is obviously trash and litter, the impact to wildlife and all the other like plants and things of that nature. And there's also like casinos run 24 hours a day. Often involve alcohol and a whole bunch of other things. So I'm just concerned about what's the overall general safety of people who want to go to the park, maybe to the shopping malls or the other areas in the neighborhood. So it's like there's already horrible public access to that. It's mostly accessible via a car. So that means most people who are going there are probably going by a car. So just kind of all, which means more gas, more traffic, more noise. Just kind of thinking of all those things that tend to impact a 24/7 operation that basically thrives off of people spending money and consuming.
Totally. And great shout out on the car and traffic component. Multiple ways to get to this location. And if they're expecting it to be a destination gaming facility, you can only expect that foot traffic to increase and car traffic to increase. So thank you, Ed.
So I'm going to go back one slide so you can also get another look at, so this is, the top photo is Ferry Point Park now, and the bottom is what Bally's is proposing.
Sorry. Okay. Sorry.
Were you all able to hear? Everyone able to hear? Okay. Yeah, so just wanted to go back to this rendering of what would be here if Bally's gets their proposal through.
And then you saw Jack's Jack right there. Why in the world?
Yeah, that's definitely
to the social one, right?
Yeah. So SEQR does generally focus on more environmental impacts, but it does also include these social considerations, and especially because we'll get to this a little bit later, but if the agency does, sorry, this was something I actually learned new, so I want to check my notes and make sure I'm going to get it right. So for private projects where there are going to be unavoidable or unmitigatable environmental impacts, the agency has to, in deciding whether or not they're going to move forward with the project, the agency needs to balance social, economic, and other essential considerations. So really important to know things like that, both for the EIS itself, for making sure that those concerns make it into the public record, but also so that if the agency needs to end up deciding we are balancing between these environmental considerations and this project, that's something that they need to be keeping in mind. And then I also see note that window collisions for birds. That's one that I have been thinking about a lot lately. Also, that's a really, really good point and really clear from this image that that's a concern. And their EIS doesn't mention that at all. The EIS talks about birds that might be using this area for habitat and somehow concludes that they won't be impacted, but doesn't talk at all about the birds, flying through the air. Anyone who's been on the Whitestone or Ferry Point Park, you see there's birds all over the place, especially close to water bodies like this. So very good thing to comment on. Light pollution. Yeah, light pollution is definitely another big one. And yeah, that no further comment on that. That's a good point.
Access to public parks and spaces are essential for communities. With this casino hotel, that access would, yeah. Because did you guys talk about 35 years?
Yeah, 2035, so 10 years. Yeah. So I think we're on the same page. Talking about the same thing. Yeah. So this is one of our biggest concerns about this project is its impacts to access to public park spaces. Ferry Point Park in total is 222 acres. So when Bally's talks about this project, including in their EIS, they talk about the 18 acres on which the project would physically be located as like no big deal. They like to highlight that currently it's parking lot. But you look at this photo and you can see that's a totally different experience, this top photo versus this bottom photo. Even if you're anywhere else on the 222 acres of Ferry Point Park, your experience is totally different if this project is here versus if it's not. And yeah, especially for communities in New York City and especially on waterfront property like this, that's huge. That's a huge impact to our communities. And Bally's in response to that comment would say, they will have under the state legislation that allows them to use public parkland for this private use, they would have to either replace the parkland with other parkland elsewhere or fund improvements to existing parkland. But they have not shown us any clear plans about where they think they can have that replacement parkland. So we're left in a situation as the public where we're just guessing what ultimately this project will mean for our public parks.
There's one more question in the chat. Does SEQR evaluate everything that goes into construction of the project in addition to the environmental impacts once it's built?
Yeah, great question. And the answer is yes. And actually that is one of the impacts that this EIS considers unmitigatable. During construction, there will be noise, there will be traffic, and they admit there's just not really much that they can do about that. So it definitely does go into the EIS. That's a great question. And so just to make sure we covered all of our, oh right, I forgot we already were on that slide. I think we hit on most of our big points on significant adverse environmental impacts. So well done, everybody. The other things that we noticed that I want to shout out there's not an adequate analysis of stormwater and sewage impacts. There's no mention at all in the EIS that Westchester Creek and the East River are both considered impaired water bodies. There's no mention of that at all. They say that they basically say, we're going to deal with it, and we're going to deal with it according to state and city guidance and regulations, but they don't give us much, if anything, in the way of here's actually how we're going to do it. So again, we're left guessing as to whether or not they actually can address their stormwater, if they have a plan that's going to work. So those are all things to keep in mind when you are looking at an EIS. Think about, okay, I'm worried about this. Do I feel like this document is telling me that they're going to avoid this impact? Like, if it's not, that's something to call out. And it's okay if you don't know what the solution is. If you don't know what they need to do about stormwater, for example, it's their job to tell you. So if something seems amiss, all you need to say to have an impact is, I'm worried about stormwater and I don't see a plan to deal with it. Or I'm worried about air quality and I don't see a way to deal with it. I'm worried about bird collisions. I don't see how they're going to deal with it. All of that can go into a useful public comment. All right, so the next component that we're just making sure there was nothing new in the chat. The next component that goes in every environmental impact statement is an alternatives analysis. So this requires the project sponsor and the agency to consider reasonable alternatives that are feasible and will still serve the project's purpose. So in the context of valleys, for example, they have to consider a range of alternatives, but they don't have to consider anything that doesn't involve a casino, because the purpose is the casino. But they do have to, they're required to consider a no action alternative. So if they don't build the casino, and then they have to, like I said earlier, they do have to choose among the alternatives based on how they can best minimize or avoid adverse environmental effects. And notable difference under SEQR, if it's a city action, the alternatives analysis also has to include an unmitigated impact alternative. But beyond that, they just have to consider a reasonable range. And that can involve things like alternative locations, changes to the size of the project, the design of the project, the timing of the project, anything that comes to mind that might minimize the environmental impact of the project. So our public participation, here's a quick overview of what Valleys did. It doesn't take long because all they did was consider no action and no unmitigated impacts. And the project purpose, like I said, is to enable what they call a destination gaming facility. So this image, I don't know how well you can read the words that are on it, but it shows the different project components. But if you can't read it, I can't on my screen, but I just happen to know what's there because I've been working on this. So it's a 500, I think, seat or 500 key hotel. I'm checking the number of seats in the casino because it's a lot. 5,000 seat casino. Restaurants, 6,000 square feet of retail space, a 2,000 person event center, a 2,000 square foot police substation, almost 5,000 parking spots. And the project will require them to remove the golf clubhouse that is currently there. And they're going to replace that clubhouse with an even bigger clubhouse. What could be changed to minimize the environmental impacts if what they're trying to do here is a gaming facility? Oh, and sorry, one more thing. This whole thing altogether is about 3 million gross square feet.
Can you say that again? The question.
What do you think? What other alternatives do you think that they could have or should have considered here?
they could turn it into a park, says iPhone.
They could, so that's the, that would be the no action alternative, would be to basically leave it as it is. They don't have to necessarily consider, changing the current use, like making it a park rather than what it currently is, which is a golf course. Apologies, I'm realizing I don't know if I gave that key fact. Right now, this is formerly known as the Trump Links Golf Course. Now it's the Bally's Links Golf Course. They operate this golf course under a lease from the city. So right now it is still city parkland, like we've been saying. It's just being used as a golf course under a lease. And I realized I had gotten distracted from Anna's point about 2030, what happens in 2035. So the golf course lease is a limited term, and the lease expires in 2035. So in the grand scheme of land use, really not that long from now. And at that time, parks can renew the lease. They could also not renew the lease, but part of Bally's action does assume the lease will be renewed, and therefore the golf course will continue to be used as a golf course. So that's definitely something to think about in your responses about alternatives.
Yeah, we also see in the chat community space, nature center, recreational facilities, all great options that can be pursued in this park, especially if this land is set to lose its lease in 2035. If it's not renewed, the community can really have a wide open space to do what they want. Yes.
That's a valid question that I have, and I'm wondering if they're answering that. If parks for whatever reason decide not to renew the lease, what happens to the structure? It's just park problem?
So just in case folks couldn't grab on the online, the question in the room was, if this lease does expire, what happens to the current facility? It has become Parks' problem. Who owns it?
The facilities that they built.
The ones that they would build.
Like
Whose problem would it be then afterwards?
Yeah, so that's exactly what I was trying to get at. So thank you for that question. So let's say the casino's built and the golf course continues to operate until 2035. Parks says no more. Bally's doesn't tell us, and they should. They right now consider the golf course and the lease renewal an integral part of their proposed action. But I don't know about you all, but I don't see why you need a golf course to operate a gaming facility, which there was a question in the chat about what that means. It's a casino. So that's an alternative that they need to tell us about in the environmental impact statement, and they don't. They just say either we have the casino and the golf course, or we have the golf course. And they don't consider what if we either have the casino but no golf course, or no casino and no golf course. And that's a problem.
We also see summer camp in the chat as another alternative.
Mm-hmm.
It seems the theme, as I'm sure many of us here were already thinking, is community centered, right? More so than whatever community benefit a casino brings, right? And so those are all more than reasonable things to be mentioning at these public hearings, right? It's important for those decision makers to hear alternative ideas and alternative visions for this space. And if the community's behind it, that's a powerful statement as well.
Mm-hmm. And I do want to clarify one thing, because you all are coming up with such beautiful visions for this park space. Legally, they don't have to, like I said, they don't have to consider anything that does not involve the casino in the context of this project, but all of those beautiful visions are why it's so great and important to get involved as early as possible in the process, like the scoping process, or even earlier if you just hear wind and want to start talking to local electeds or the relevant agency about your thoughts. Because the earlier you get those creative ideas in, like why shouldn't there be a summer camp here? That's something that can then make its way more easily into the project plans. And David will talk a little bit more about that in the context of the Cross Bronx project. So, oh, I forgot about this slide. Sorry, y'all. So just for the sake of time, I'm going to keep it moving, but just quickly, the other things that I've been thinking about with this project are as simple as the size. Why does it need to be 5,000 seat casino? Why does it need to be a 500 key hotel? Like they could either, keep everything they want to do and just make it smaller. They have to consider that, I think. Or they can take out all of these extraneous things that you really don't need to operate a casino, like the golf course, like the retail space, like the restaurants, those are all potential alternatives that would have a lesser impact than what they're currently proposing. I'm going to skip this point. It's a little too in the weeds, but the point is basically just that in addition to making sure that they consider the alternatives, the reasonable range of alternatives, another place to comment is sometimes they try to pull shady things and say things that don't make any sense. Like this example, if anyone does want to read it while I'm talking, is getting at they try to make the no action alternative, so the no casino scenario, seem worse than it is by saying like, oh, well, there's no new parkland if we don't build the casino because we're not going to buy new parkland. And it's like, okay, but we also lose this parkland in your scenario. So it's not quite, it's just a little bit not quite as it seems the way that they phrase it. And that's something else to look out for throughout the whole environmental impact statement. If you're reading something and you're confused, comment on it. I read this thing, I didn't understand it. That's a problem.
In the chat, Jackie says, do they have to consider things like increasing ferry service?
Yeah, that's a good question. I wouldn't say that they have to consider things like that unless if they somehow were having a negative impact on ferry service, like if ferry service was disrupted, for example, by the construction, then they would have to consider it. But in terms of like adding, to the extent your question is about adding resources like ferry service, it's not something they have to consider, but it's something, those are the kinds of things that you can throw in there as kind of a, I don't want you to build this project, or if you do want them to build the project, I guess I'm not here to tell you what you think is best, anyone on this call. But that's actually worth noting is these are all good things to comment, even if you don't necessarily oppose a project. You can say, I think the casino is a great idea for the Bronx, but I think it would be even better if they paid to increase ferry service. I think it would be even better if they also had a summer camp at the park. Those are all good things to include in comments as well. Okay, and the next up is mitigation. So the environmental impact statement has to include an explanation of what they're going to do, basically, to minimize or avoid the environmental impact of the project to the maximum extent practicable. And under the city review process, they can't just say we're going to do X, Y, Z. They are supposed to demonstrate that their plans will be effective and discuss what kind of effort they'll take and any new impacts that would result from the mitigation itself. And NEPA has a similar requirement as well. So some things to look out for when you're looking at an EIS is mitigation measures are lack of monitoring or lack of maintenance plans. So one thing we see a lot, for example, when we're looking at stormwater runoff controls is we're going to build a catchment basin to slow down the runoff of the stormwater toward our waterways and facilitate it sinking better into the ground. But there's all kinds of stuff that gets caught in those catchment basins. There's trash and other debris, sediment builds up over time and can fill in those catchment basins. So we want to look out for plans to control that and to come through and make sure the catchment basins, et cetera, are still operating as they should. So looking at what this project is going to look like. What are some mitigation measures that you'd want to see Bally's investigate? And what concerns do you have about their ability to actually follow through on those mitigation measures? So thinking again back to the impacts that we discussed, bird collision, stormwater runoff. One thing we didn't focus on, but is huge here is air quality impacts from the traffic that this will bring in. There's environmental justice concerns that we'll get to, and I think the next slide. So what are some ideas that you all have for how Bally's could avoid or minimize those impacts?
Again, remember there's things like noise that is relevant to consider. All that traffic coming through and the experience on the west side of the park can be impacted by that. So a whole host of things that we're able to consider.
We just said zero trust in them doing anything, which is actually, fair, very fair, and something that's worth commenting on. You can say, they're making all these promises, but who's going to make sure that they actually do it?
Which, as we all know, is quite an issue, unfortunately, with a lot of developments like this in the Bronx and beyond.
Mm-hmm.
I think in that neighborhood, assuming the project goes through, I'd be concerned about flooding.
Yes.
Like a more impermeable surface causing more flooding.
That's a great point. Yeah, Anna here in the room suggested flooding as something to mitigate, and this area does lie within the 100 and 500 year floodplains, which means during those once in every 100-year storms that we hear about, this area will flood significantly. And as we know, with climate change and increased rainfall, the reality in New York City is that will increase citywide flooding and problems like that. So very important to consider. The neighborhood the surrounding neighborhood is set to see flooding, and the increase in impervious surfaces doesn't really help that.
Mm-hmm. And like I mentioned earlier, Bally's, in terms of how they're going to mitigate, how they're going to minimize those impacts, they talk about being in compliant, that they're going to comply with what the city requires of them. They kind of gesture generally toward things like catchment basins, and I think they maybe are talking about a rain garden or something, but they don't commit to anything or talk about why those plans will work. They just kind of say all the things they could do. They don't say what they actually are going to do. And that is a problem.
Which, to Dara's point earlier about commenting as early as possible, asking for these details as early as possible, kind of mandates that they provide us those details as early as possible to give us more time to comment on them and understand what those plans are and refine them, right? If they're not perfect, we have the opportunity to continue commenting on them. But if they start late in that process, our opportunity becomes limited.
Mm-hmm. And Moon does also see comment in the chat about mitigating bird window collisions. There's a lot of really quite simple ways to deter birds from window collisions, but none of those appear in the EIS because, like I said, they don't even talk about window collisions in the EIS. So definitely something to throw into some comments. And just again, keep it moving. I think we hit on the main points about mitigation, but the bottom line that I think I want to get across here is they have to tell you what they're planning to do. And if you feel like they're not, then let them know in some comments. And then what I was trying to get at with the concerns about private corporation, we did get earlier at, are they actually going to do what they say they're going to do? What happens when the day comes that they need to pay out all of these like community benefits or mitigation measures they're promising, and the company's in the red and they don't have the money? Where does that leave us? And sometimes we'll see in EISs. So for example, here, actually, there's a good example here. Bally's, they do talk about traffic being a problem. There are problems with that analysis, but that's for another day. But one of their proposed mitigation measures is they say that they're exploring a new overpass over Lafayette Avenue. And that's not really up to them. If there's going to be a new overpass over Lafayette Avenue, there's a number of city and probably state approvals that they would need for that. And I see project applicants pulling things like that quite a bit, saying, oh, you're worried about sewer impacts. There's going to be a new sewer main line. And it's like, you don't get to make that decision. And you can't promise us that the agency is going to do that. So if they're going to make promises like that, they need to have commitments in writing from the agency. Those commitments can come at the final EIS stage. They don't need to be in the DEIS, which I disagree with in principle, but that's the law. But they still can't just go promising things and not following through.
Comment, any type of construction alone causes so much pollution and traffic. Is the overall construction process part of the environmental assessment?
Yeah, it is. So yeah, we talked briefly about this earlier. But they do have to consider impacts from construction as well.
And we think this site in particular, it's even more relevant and more imperative that they consider those impacts because they would be building on a former landfill. So any ground intrusive activities theoretically could release, toxic gases, methane, or contaminants like arsenic and lead into groundwater. And so it's even more important, that they highlight their plans for mitigating that. And yeah, just overall great question on construction. Even things like stormwater, air quality, noise, just the general things that we see with construction must also be considered.
This whole Lafayette overpass, are they like seriously talking about building an overpass in Lafayette all the way to the casino?
No, it's from the service roads. So there's a ring road that's part of this project. Yeah, so right at the start, they would build a new overpass, or they propose a new overpass to be built. There's some renderings online, but that's the plan. Yeah.
But they're just, what it says in the EIS right now is they're exploring the feasibility. Yeah. So we don't know that much more about it right now.
And isn't that like adjacent to MTA Bridges and Funnels property, which is the Whitestone Bridge? Like there's those restrictions as well.
Yeah. Yep. Okay, then I think this is the last section of my portion of the presentation. Thank you for bearing with me. It's a big one, environmental justice. So New York has a pretty new law as of January 1st of this year that requires EISs to identify effects of the proposed action on disadvantaged communities. And that includes impacts that cause or increase a disproportionate pollution burden. And this map on the right, everything in orange there is considered a disadvantaged community. And that's a designation that this map is available. The link is there on the slide. I meant to change that so it would look like HTTPS, it says, but we'll send around helpful links in a follow-up email maybe. But this is a map that you can access and look all over New York State and see what New York considers a disadvantaged community. And it even, like, when you can see why, like what factors cause that designation. And a little bit more about this later in the take action section. But right now, all we have is this law that says they have to consider if these disproportionate impacts on disadvantaged communities. DEC, Department of Environmental Conservation, is currently in the process of putting together their implementing regulations, which will give us more detail on what is involved in that analysis. So that's another opportunity that we'll talk about later. And just to flag real quick, unfortunately, environmental justice is no longer a consideration under NEPA. It was. That has been very recently changed. So that's why it's so important, like I said earlier, when the state and federal government are working together on a project. Federal government, their NEPA documents will not talk about environmental justice moving forward, but the state agency will have to still do that analysis to fulfill their requirements under state law. So turning to Bally's, this is their version of that map zoomed in on this portion of the Bronx. So everything in purple is considered a disadvantaged community. Again, that red encircled portion in the middle there is where they're going to build this complex. And the reason that they are that 1,100 feet line is there is because they are kind of like, they're like, well, there's not really impacts to disadvantaged communities because the project's 1,100 feet from the nearest disadvantaged community. But that's because it's in a park. Doesn't mean there's not going to be impacts. So, but now I'm doing your job. I'm answering the question. So I'll stop, but would love to hear folks' thoughts on their environmental justice analysis. And I've included some key points here to think about. So, because if you don't know what they're doing in the analysis, it's hard to answer the question. But first of all, the analysis is 3 pages. That's it. And some key points from the analysis. Like I said, they say the affected area is wholly outside of a DAC. The only significant adverse impacts they identify are shadows, transportation, noise, and construction, both traffic and noise from construction. They say that air and noise emissions may create a pollution burden, but traffic itself does not constitute pollution. And then they reference their broader air quality discussion, which concluded that there were no significant impacts because there wasn't projected to be an increase in emissions. And then finally, they're exploring the feasibility of constructing that overpass I mentioned as a way to avoid air quality impacts from traffic. So any thoughts from what you have in front of you here? Oh, thanks, Anna, for putting that link in the chat. So I'll give you one more hint, because this note on the air quality deserves a little bit more explanation. So they had to do an air quality analysis that began with establishing a baseline for the air quality in the area so that they could then comment on how much worse the air quality might get. And the air quality monitoring stations that they used for that analysis, there's one in the South Bronx, just west of the Bruckner Expressway. There's one in Hunts Point, and there's one in Flushing right next to the Long Island Expressway in what appears to be a parking lot. So for those of you who might not be so familiar with the area, those are not,
It's not the right.
they're not even on this map. Like this map does not show where any of those monitoring stations are.
We'll wait for a couple comments, just for a few more seconds. But if you don't have any comments right now, that's obviously totally okay. Just, of course, something to keep your mind on when considering documents like this, right? Does their analysis meet that criteria of, addressing disadvantaged communities to the extent that the state law requires it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Great point in the chat, right? Green spaces should be a respite from traffic and noise and just, urban construction and buildings, right? And this is bringing more of that into a park, which, for the immediate community is really their only sense of relief from those factors. So great point in the chat.
And that also comes back again to, we don't know where they're planning to put this replacement parkland that they're promising, or where they're planning to put these investments in improving other parkland. Where can they put replacement parkland that's going to, benefit this community? that's most directly impacted? Where are they going to find waterfront property that is available for public park space, and that benefits these communities? All right, for the sake of time, we'll move on. But what I was just real quick. So, for example, with the air quality, just one example, the air quality situation. The law requires them to consider if there's going to be an increase in emissions, a decrease in air quality in this community. If you're going to place air monitoring stations in places that might have more more emissions already, that difference is way smaller than if perhaps, and I don't really know, but like I said, it's their responsibility to tell us, is the air quality in this area better than in Hunts Point, for example, in Flushing, in the South Bronx? If it is, that's a much bigger change as a result of this project. So by, elevating that baseline, they're potentially cutting their responsibility to explain what impact this project is going to have on these communities. And that's not acceptable. And sorry, one more thing, just I really want to underscore that is, I've said it before, I'll say it again, it's so important. It's their responsibility to tell you what the problems are and what they're going to do about them. So that comment about traffic doesn't equal pollution, but then they're also saying maybe there will be an air quality problem. Like, it's just in 3 pages, they squeeze in a lot of very confusing, internally inconsistent statements. And that itself is something worth calling out. So just to wrap up on my portion of the presentation, with just a couple general tips for effective public comments. Like we've been saying, get involved as early as possible, and make sure that your comments are focused on the project itself. It's important to express your frustrations and your dissatisfaction with the project, but what the agency really cares about when they're making their decisions is the project's impacts, the alternatives, the mitigation, and if you have any new news they haven't considered, that's important as well. But making sure that you really have those facts about the impacts, that as a community member, that there's a problem here, that needs to go in your comments. And if you have studies or articles that you want to reference, you should attach those to your comments, again, because it's important to build the record, to make sure the agency has in front of them all the important information. And I'm not going to read through these last few for the sake of time, except to plug the idea of coalition building. I like to say no one knows everything, but together we know a lot. So gathering your community together, connecting with like-minded organizations, can be a great way to broaden your impact.
And we'll actually skip this poll activity as well. I think throughout the workshop so far, we did a great job at identifying alternatives and just talking through the project, and for the sake of time. Okay, so thank you for all of that, Dara. Did a great job walking us through SEQR and the Bally's project. I just want to quickly highlight the Uniform Land Use Review Procedure, otherwise known as ULURP, which is coinciding with the Bally's process right now. This is a city land use review procedure, and it's New York City's specific process for determining how land is used. When we talk about zoning, rezoning, this is what we're referencing, this procedure. Some key participants include community boards, the borough president, the city council, and the mayor. And right here highlighted, we have the City Planning Commission, because they tend to be the lead agency for many of these projects that go before the City Planning Commission, but also throughout the ULURP process. And they will be reviewing the Bally's process, the Bally's project, and there will be opportunity for public comment when that comes due, as I mentioned on that last bullet. So just to keep us moving along, we're now going to talk about environmental assessments. So Dara focused on environmental impact statements, which are SEQR specific. well, not specific, but at least that particular reference was in reference to a secret process. And now we'll be talking about environmental assessments in the NEPA context. And just as we kind of mentioned previously, if significant environmental impacts are unknown or not reasonably foreseeable, the lead agency must prepare their environmental assessment. Excuse me. This is after they've determined that the project does not need a categorical exclusion. So if they determine that again this project will have some sort of impact, the EA must follow. There is a reality where if they determine an EA is not required, they can, or rather that an EIS will be required, they can skip the EA and jump right towards the EIS. But again, that is a higher level of kind of review and a higher level of significance when compared to the EA. As Dara mentioned earlier, each federal agency has developed their own NEPA methods for preparing an EA. So there's slight differences between each agency. However, there are some general concepts that they all need to kind of cover, including the purpose or need for the proposed action. Comparing it to Dara's example with Bally's, the purpose or need would be to create a gaming facility. An alternatives assessment, as we talked about alternatives, environmental impacts, of course, that's the main focus of this document. And agencies and other entities that were consulted throughout the process. And based on the EA's findings, two things can occur. FONSI can be issued, which Dara, if you don't mind.
The finding of no significant impact.
Thank you. And if that's issued, then, as the name suggests, there has been no significant impact identified and the project can proceed. Or at least in the context of the EAs is what we're working through here. If there is significant impact, then the EIS must follow. Again, that's a higher level of scrutiny and review that's required. And again, for actions involving federal agencies and a state agency, the state agency must still comply with SEQR, which is especially important given that certain parts of federal regulations are being kind of tweaked in ways that may not have a community's best interest in mind. I'll put it like that. So moving on, this is of course a priority project for many of us on this call right now. But it's another project study centered around the Cross Bronx Expressway, namely the 5 Bridges project, which is a project to repair 5 bridges along the Cross Bronx Expressway, and also construct a connector alongside the expressway to allow for connection during construction. And this is a great, the greatness of the project is to be discussed, but it's a great example rather at how early involvement in the process can really have an impact on things like alternatives that are developed, as the project moves along. So you can see just right here, this is one of my favorite comparison photos. The first draft, alternative option 1A, was the first draft alternative proposed by New York State DOT, who is the state agency overseeing this project. And through conversations with local stakeholders, another alternative option was created, which is this more pedestrian friendly looking pathway, and the conversation is still ongoing. So let's continue through here. And if we look at this project as a whole, right, I mentioned it's led by New York State Department of Transportation, and Dara mentioned earlier the Federal Highway Administration, and therefore this is a NEPA, project. In addition to various social concerns, right, as many of us may know, the Cross Bronx Expressway is a, significantly impairing expressway in the Bronx. The history behind it is very uncomfortable and very impactful for the Bronx. It's kind of bisected communities and really had a terrible impact in the borough. So other than those social considerations, which are not to be ignored, environmental considerations, at least our initial ones, are, include air quality and stormwater, right? If you're building another expansion of this expressway over the Bronx River, we can only expect stormwater impacts, and of course air quality from the increase in car traffic. And so the actual environmental assessment for this project is still being developed. It's expected in late May, early June. But that's not any reason for us to not begin thinking about these considerations right now. So when that time does come and the public comment opportunity does open, we have an idea of what we want to talk about. So before I get into the poll activity.
Oh, I typed it out for us.
Oh,
nice. Thank you.
okay, cool. Oh, perfect. Yeah, go ahead and launch it now. So as we talk through some of this, right, we have a poll up on the screen now. What are some of your concerns regarding the project? Feel free to go ahead and select some of that. But I would love to open the floor, Victoria, if you would like to just say a couple comments from your perspective and the Bronx River Alliance's perspective on the project thus far. Things to come.
Sure. Thanks. And so I will just note that one thing that our community members and members of the No Cross Bronx Expansion Coalition have named time and time again is that this highway has been a historical harm to our communities, and that any project that devotes this huge amount of resources to that structure that has been so harmful should have a net benefit to the communities that have been harmed by the Cross Bronx Expressway. The project as originally proposed instead would essentially expand the impact of the expressway as it currently exists, right? So the connector roadway that they were originally proposing, the purpose of it is to minimize the amount of construction time that it would take to rebuild the elevated sections of the highway that need to be repaired. However, does that additional or 2 fewer years of construction time potentially, right? Potential minimal construction time. It would still be at least 4 years of construction that would be impacting the neighborhoods. Is that worth the lifetime, the human lifetime's worth of impacts that building an additional structure would have when it comes to the urban heat island effect that we already have, we already face in the South Bronx, the additional amount of concrete, impermeable surfaces, loss of native habitat, loss of parkland acreage, things like this. So, those are the concerns that community members have had to this point, and concerns that we continue to have despite the different options that have been proposed, because again, it's clear that NISDOT at the end of the day would prefer to build this structure, regardless of the cost to the community that then has to live with it for the next 80 plus years.
Yeah, thank you, Victoria. All relevant concerns for environmental considerations and social impacts, right? Just looking at the poll right now in the chat, we see air quality as the #1 concern right now, with water pollution, wildlife habitat coming in second. All relevant concerns. Again, it's a little bit difficult to kind of dive into this project at this particular point compared to the Bally's project, because their environmental assessment is yet to be released. The Bally's draft environmental impact statement is out right now. But we do want to put this at the forefront of everyone's attention, because it's coming very soon. And the time for all of us to comment, or rather all of you to comment, the public, will be coming soon as well. So things to keep in mind and to stay on top of. We'll kind of talk about how we can all take action collectively in regards to this project in just a couple slides. But yeah, certainly want to highlight this project as it's just another, impactful project going on in the Bronx right now. So we'll keep on moving along. We're getting close to time here, so I'm actually going to skip my next slide, which was again the poll activity that we kind of just answered, and we saw air quality, water pollution, and wildlife habitat coming up front. But all of these honestly are concerns that community has expressed and are valid for commenting on the environmental assessment.
If you have other concerns, feel free to put them in the chat.
Yes, please, as we continue along here. Okay, so that was a lot. We talked through SEQR, SEQR, a little bit on ULURP, and a little bit on NEPA. So all of that combined, let's now talk about, now that we have that kind of common understanding, now let's talk about how we can take action and what the public, what options are open to the public to impact these processes. So you see a couple photos here, hearings and petitions are all relevant. So let's get into some of that. Just a generic, general slide on public comment periods to orient us. Right, these comment periods are one of the most important parts of this entire environmental review process. There are multiple opportunities for public comment, and they are taken into consideration. And if they're not, at the end of the whole process, as Dara mentioned, there is opportunity for some type of legal recourse to kind of push back against what could be a project that proceeds without proper considerations. So when thinking about reviewing some of these documents, like draft scope of works or draft environmental impact statements, it's just important to kind of keep in mind some of the following, which is much of what we already discussed earlier in the workshop, but just to highlight them again here. Does a draft environmental impact statement adequately can't get that word out, adequately describe the landscape, the community, the property that they're proposing this project, right? We all, again, I mentioned at the top, have our own unique lived experiences and know a particular community or neighborhood best, if you live there, right? And so if a developer is coming in to propose a project, they might not have that same understanding that you have. And so it's important to let that be heard and to ensure that, that's taken into consideration. Of course, does the draft environmental impact statement accurately describe those environmental impacts of the project? As Dara talked about mitigation, right? Is mitigation properly considered? Are alternatives considered, a reasonable range of alternatives? Not just the no action and just the with action. We need that range of alternatives for the community to have a say on what's, to be done with whatever piece of land the project is considered on. And lastly, can the lead agency, make a rational decision based on the acceptance of those adverse impacts, right? If they're just totally ignoring certain things and proposing the action, that's, that can be considered something that can be legal actions can be taken on. And just quickly to remember, of course, I keep on reiterating it, but it's so important, right? You don't need to be an expert in a particular area of study to kind of, say your piece during these comment periods. Your perspective, your experience is really what's needed. And to be quite frank, sometimes these public comment periods don't even see that much turnout or that much involvement. And so it's even more imperative that people show up and give their opinions, give thetheir experience. And of course, if, for whatever reason, there's something you're unsure of, or you're just unsure if, a comment can be directed towards whatever project or proposal, any one of our organizations would be happy to steer you in the right direction and help you develop whatever comment is on your mind. All right, so now let's get into what we can all do right now to kind of begin influencing some of these projects. In regards to the Cross Bronx Expressway 5 Bridges project, there's already a couple things that are ongoing. So we're going to get into quite a few QR codes. So warning, I went a little QR code crazy. But the first thing that we can do is sign on to this petition, which is essentially to express to the governor that we don't want new highways, or rather, you don't want a new highway in the Bronx, and to halt the expansion of the Cross Bronx Expressway. So that's the first QR code there at the top. You'll see that quite a few people have already filled this out, but the more the merrier, and of course, that sends a stronger message to those decision makers. I see Ed's hand just went up. Ed, go for it.
Yeah, I just kind of want to share that something also that we did touch on is that we kind of already know that this will set the precedent for any repairs alongside I-95 throughout the corridor. They're already looking at other areas. They're saying they're not projects, that they're merely studies. But we know studies become projects when they find funding, like they found funding for this project. So this also could dictate how the rest of I-95 looks in the future. And as we've already seen, they've expanded the Bruckner Expressway. Although they made the Sheridan Expressway a boulevard, it definitely has a larger footprint. And the Van Wyck is currently getting expanded. The VQE has portions where they've considered expansion. So we know that larger roadways is what DOT is focusing on and seems to be incentivized to do.
Yeah, Ed brings up a very important point, in that what happens in one project really can provide a baseline for what happens in other projects. And so being able to comment now and make sure that they kind of address concerns that community might be having right now is ever more important. Ed mentioned a couple different examples going on in New York City and the Bronx. But that's relevant statewide, that's relevant nationwide, honestly. So really important to get those comments in as early as possible. And they have impact on your community. So thank you for that, Ed. Next up, of course, follow the Bronx River Alliance. They'll provide you with all the upcoming public hearings, dates, and all types of other events for this project. Sign up for the newsletter. That's the bottom QR code, and stay up to date on what's going on. And lastly, just so we're all aware, and again, if you sign up for the newsletter, or just follow Bronx River Alliance on any social media, you'll certainly see this, but just keep an eye out for when the environmental assessment does drop. We're expecting late May, early June, but it'll be imperative to get strong turnout, community turnout and comments, and to send a strong message if this is something you're really against.
And if you remember from the slide on the FHWA, it'll be only required to have a 30-day public comment period. We're hoping they decide to extend it beyond that, but all we're guaranteed is 30 days.
Yes.
This is Victoria here from Bronx River Alliance. I also just wanted to, mention, I put this in the chat, but like a thing to question is, a 30-day public comment period actually equitable? Are historically marginalized communities being given enough time to read through a large technical document, digest it, and then provide thoughtful commentary based off of lived experience? So one of the things that the petition is actually asking for, regardless of how folks feel about the project itself, is to expand the public comment period to at least 60 days. And that's something that is to allow for meaningful engagement from our community members, no matter how they feel about the project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much, Victoria. That's a really, really important point that is so important. It should have been in the presentation, actually. I'm glad you brought it up, which is that another thing that you can always either comment on during the comment period or get on top of the agency about earlier are the procedures that they're going through enough to be engaging the public the way that they need to, getting the information from the public that they need to get from the public. So that's something I almost always include in comments is, yeah, I'm writing this comment, but it's my job. 30 days wasn't enough for all the people who might be worried about this, especially people who it's not their job. They're just the people who are impacted. And same thing with things like public hearings. So, if the public hearing was held at 10 a.m. on a Thursday, you're missing a lot of people who just can't show up at City Hall at 10 a.m. on a Thursday. Is that enough to say that you've engaged the community?
Yeah, and that totally reinforces the point about, that sometimes, these public hearings or public comments don't receive that much input for many of the reasons just mentioned. So that equitable access is certainly, something that needs to be taken into account as well.
And we do see at least DEC being pretty responsive to these requests a lot of the time. I've made 2 of these requests recently, like, oh, the comment period that you're doing isn't long enough, and they've extended it. So, yeah, easy way to have an impact.
Yeah. Okay, I hope you all grab these QR codes. Moving along. One more slide here, just again reinforcing, give feedback directly to NICEDOT. Here's some of their information, and then you can scan that QR code on the bottom to go to their project website. I won't spend too much time on this slide. I'll just give you all the second or two to grab the QR code.
Well, and relevant to there was a question about, will these be sent around, the slides be sent around? And I think the answer is yes.
Yeah.
And I mentioned, I think I'd like to, I meant to add some more links also. So look out for that too, some kind of list of relevant links as well as these slides.
And I did forget that. So pardon my causing you all to hastily grab these QR codes. We will provide these afterwards. Just another, slide with more QR codes. I warned you all, I went QR crazy. This is in regards to the Bally's Casino and Hotel. The first QR code is to access the SEQR portal. Actually, the portal is quite difficult to find if you don't know what you're looking for, and then it's even more difficult to find the specific project that you're looking for. So this QR code will take you exactly to the project that we're discussing. If you scroll down to the bottom, and I'm mentioning this just in general for the recording, but if you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see a section labeled DEIS and Notice of Completion. The first file under that tab is what you'll want to download. It'll bring up a zip file on your computer, and then you can open it and find all your.
Yeah,
it's a lot. It's a lot. Yeah. So that's how you get to that. Right now, actually today, there was a public hearing at the Bronx Borough President's office in regards to Bally's. And so they're accepting written comments until the 15th. So very soon, feel free to scan the QR code. Again, we'll send these out. But really important to get some written comments into the borough president. They are one of the decision makers in the process. It's a non-binding vote that they have, but it sends a message, if they vote one way or the other. So we want to try and impact that as much as we can, if we're, against or for this project. And then, of course, follow up with Save the Sound, follow our newsletter. Just like Bronx River Alliance, we'll make sure you stay up to date with all these upcoming dates and opportunities for, public involvement.
And just to preview some of those real quick, so after the Bronx Borough President's decision, next up is the City Planning Commission, which is the first binding vote in this is the ULURP process. The ULURP process is where we have the community boards and the borough president participating. And then the City Planning Commission is where ULURP and SEQR really intersect. So the City Planning Commission in probably late May or early June will accept written comments and have a public hearing. And they will, if they say yes, then the project goes forward to the city council. But if they say no, it's over. So that would be great. And like I said, we're not here to tell you. I guess I kind of have maybe been telling you how to feel about Bally's, but if you think the project's great, then we want to see you participate. This presentation is about encouraging public participation in these processes. But even if you support the casino, if maybe you think that they should also run a summer camp, or you think that they should do a better job, they should be giving air filters to all the schools to mitigate the air quality impacts, whatever ideas you might have about how it can be a better project for this community, this is your time to get those thoughts in.
One last slide and one last QR code. Really quick, just a quick word on this. Dara mentioned earlier, but this is in regards to the environmental justice siting law regulations, right? How they're requiring the projects take into account disadvantaged communities and the impacts to them. This is an ongoing comment period, right? We can use a lot of what we learned today to kind of have our voices heard in that regard. Again, comments being accepted until May 7th. There are opportunities for virtual and in-person public hearings, as you see there. I won't really go into too much more on this, but feel free to check out the project site and learn a little bit more. Sorry. Yeah.
We have another attorney in the room. Nothing.
Okay. Cool. All right. Awesome.
Gonna shout out because he's been helpful though. Damon from New York Lawyers for the Public Interest is also here. And if you all have any questions, then he's also here to help answer them.
As you can see, it's important to consider all of your partners and like-minded neighbors in these kind of discussions, right? Like as Dara mentioned before, individually we may not know a lot, but together we can really build that consensus. And it's even more important to build that community and work together to have your voices heard, to have an impact on these projects. The more voices, the better. And that's how ultimately at the end of the day we're heard. So I want to shout that out. And finally, thank you for bearing with us. Certainly was a lot that we covered. Again, there'll be recordings and the presentation will be shared with links. But if there are any last minute questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or in the room, say it out loud. But yeah, we thank you for being with us today.
And you can just unmute yourself if you have questions. But I'm also going to open the chat and see if there's anything. But in the meantime, yeah, feel free to unmute and ask any questions you might have.
Or raise hands.
There's a question about ULURP from Mundo a little while ago. Doesn't the City Planning Commission tend to go whichever way the electeds go? ULURP is there's good and bad about ULURP. The good is it does provide a lot of opportunity for public involvement. The bad is there is a lot of skepticism about how much the people making decisions really listen to that input. And I would say it's a mixed bag. City Planning Commission, they do tend more often than not to, if the project has gotten started on the ULURP pipeline, unfortunately, more often than not, it does mean City Planning Commission is probably already planning to approve the project, but that doesn't mean that you can't make your voice heard. There's never say never. And also, even if they are going to approve the project, like we've been talking about, that's also an opportunity to have an impact on what the project actually ends up looking like and how the impacts can be minimized or what benefits can be promised to the community in kind of in exchange for the project.
And if no one really feels super comfortable asking a question or coming off mute while we're recording, we can stop the recording and take the last couple of minutes to take some questions. Now.